What was the hardest piece of news you've had to tell someone? Telling my sister that our dad's heart attack was indeed fatal. After my wife woke up from a medically induced coma, I had to tell her our son died. The look of soul-shattering pain still bothers me. Tell my dad, who was in the hospital 2 weeks away from his own death, that his father had died. Dad hadn't yet accepted that he himself was dying, though my sister and I could see it. Grandpa had been in hospice for 2 months, so we all knew that his end was near. In the week between Grandpa's death and his funeral, Dad began to accept that he didn't have much time left. Dad made it to Grandpa's funeral, albeit via ambulance wheelchair, and saw his extended family for the last time. That was a surreal experience for me, watching him say goodbye. Edit. Typo. Mom and her 4-year-old daughter were in a house fire. Mom had 3rd-degree burns over 60% of her body. She was put in a medically induced coma. After extubating the mom a few days later, my roommate, a surgery resident, had to tell her that her daughter was brain dead. I had to tell my mom that the bike that I reported stolen to the police was under the duck-in porch. I had to tell my spouse and children that my 26-year-old took his own life. After my parents split up, my dad moved us in with his mother. She was one of those grandmas who woke up every morning to get my siblings and I up for school because my dad left for work at 4 AM and worked 12-hour days usually. One day she didn't wake us up. Just as was coming out of my room, I saw my younger, 4 years, I was 17, coming out of her room. We just kind of looked at each other and had an oh it moment. I went in to check on grandma. She was cold, so I called 911 and then had to call dad. That was hard, and because he worked about 30 minutes away, this was the 90s, so cell phones weren't that common yet. I had to call all the aunts and uncles too, and then dig out grandma's DNA from where dad told me it was and hand it to the EMTs that showed up. So it was definitely the 7 worst calls of my life so far. Edit. Thank you all for the messages of sympathy, condolence, I really appreciate it. For all other replies, comments, I'm trying to reply to them as I can. I'm at work right now. Telling my mom over the phone while she's in the hospital that I just found my dad in bed, passed away. She was in so much denial that he had died. She tried to convince me that maybe he's just doped up on sleeping pills. I wished it were true, but I had already knew he was gone when I tried to move him. Stiff as a board. Paramedics came in and confirmed he died. Mum was on the phone still and heard everything. I never knew heartbreak could have a sound until I heard my mom break down on the phone. I tried to keep my composure, but I ended up having to mute the phone call and let some tears out myself. This was almost 2 years ago. Edit. This is my first Reddit post. Thank you all for the condolences. And thank you so much for the platinum. Definitely telling my grandmother that her daughter, my mother, had just died. Nothing quite prepares you for telling someone about a death. Bar regular of mine almost fell to his death washing windows in a 4-story building. He miraculously survived yet broke every bone in his body and cracked his skull. First responders were firefighters right near Houston Street and Broadway in Nick. If they hadn't responded, he would have died right there. Fast forward 4 weeks later, the 15th of September, 2001, he is out of his coma and finally able to be taken home by his sister and out of hospice. Barely able to speak, he manages to whisper that he wants her pass him by the fire station 2 blocks down so he could thank his rescuers. His sister had to then explain the black smoke still lingering in the air, the entirety of the 9/11 attacks, and that every single first responder that helped him perished. Sometimes that worn out older man sitting at the bar day drinking red wine has a really good story to tell. Broke my heart. Edit. Tie sensitive stranger for my first silver and gold. Telling someone's family that we are giving up on searching for their loved ones who are lost at sea. I had to tell my wife that our 8-year-old son had died in the night. He was on hospice and it was expected, but that was still hard. Then I had to phone my older children and tell them Thursday will mark 2 years. Professionally, I had to tell the parents of a 20-year-old basketball star that his drug use did not account for his unusual thoughts and behaviors, that he was, in fact, psychotic and likely schizophrenic. When I told my dad that he was in the early stage of dying and was moving to hospice care, he told me, Oh good, because he was so tired of being sick with Parkinson's. He died 2 weeks later. Tell my dad who had dementia my mother passed away from cancer. Telling my 4-year-old his papa had died. I headed up a few departments at my last job, and as dept head, I had to be the one to fire people in those departments. It always sucks. Even if they are the worst and totally deserve it. Never feels good to take away someone's security. Had to call my brother, sisters, and mother when I found my father dead, after calling 911 and my wife. My brother, who was active military at the time, had to be granted emergency leave for my mother who was on her deathbed after a short but destructive battle with cancer. They took more than 24 hours to sign one name on that document to release him, even knowing the circumstances. When he became noticeably upset that they were taking their time with it, they pulled him aside and threatened to make him undergo a psych evaluation for being, understandably, angry. She died while he was on his flight home. I had to tell him over the phone that he missed the passing of our mom and he wouldn't ever be able to say goodbye. That was rough. I had to tell a doctor that the family decided that it was time to let mom go peacefully. Had to call my girlfriend parents at 1 AM to tell them there was a bad accident, that their daughter was en route to ER and I thought she would be okay. She died on arrival. Worst day of my life. I had to call my friend's girlfriend to let her know he'd been killed in an accident, and then share that news with his best friend on a pursuant call. Telling my mom I was at a shrink to get help for depression. Left out the suicidal part on purpose. Also, confirming the news that my dad died when his friend since childhood called. Trying to explain to my 4-year-old niece why my longtime girlfriend wasn't with me anymore. She just didn't understand and kept asking questions like, I thought auntie loved you? Why did she leave? The breakup was recent and that conversation hurt, man. I had to tell my mom that my dad died. 40 years later I had to tell my kids I had cancer. I'm sorry, I should have said I beat it. At least for now. Oh, thank you for silver. So sweet. One Sunday at church I was walking my baby outside when one of my best friend's mom came up to me. She was in hunting attire and looked to be in complete shock. She told me her husband, my friend's dad, had just fallen out of his tree stand and broken his neck and died. And she asked me to go get her daughter out of church to let her know. It was one of the worst days in my life. I had to tell my girlfriend that her grandmother had passed away. Her mom called me and asked me to break the news to her, since she's terrible at that stuff. We had only been together about a year and I had to leave work to drive over and tell her. She had just come back from visiting her grandmother a few provinces away a few days earlier and the doctors said she would be okay. She was so close with her grandmother I knew it would be devastating to her. It was. She cried for a few hours. I booked her on the next flight home and helped her pack. To this day something I'll never forget doing. On the plus side, we are still together almost 7 years later and have a beautiful baby girl. I like to think that the moment brought us closer together. I had to tell my best friend one of his fraternity brothers committed suicide. He was out of school for the semester and I knew informing him wouldn't be the top priority by anyone in the house. So I called him. It was the most heartbreaking thing to have to do, especially over the phone. I wished I could have been there for him in person. I think it was the only time I'd seen him cry. I worked as a pediatric psychology fellow while in graduate school, PhD clinical psychology. This involved providing psychological services for all children in the hospital. One of my very first weeks I was shadowing a more experienced fellow and we encountered a family whose child, 7-year-old, was hospitalized after she was in a car accident with her father. Her father died in the accident and no one in her family was comfortable directly explaining this to the child. They had used a lot of religious euphemisms about death. He's watching over you in heaven. He's with you in spirit. But this language is not concrete enough for a young child who doesn't really understand death. Sitting with this child, body brace, lacerations all over, very flat affect, and explaining to her what death was, that her father had died, and having to ask questions to make sure she understood was one of the most traumatizing experiences of my graduate training. I can still vividly imagine her face while we were telling her and the tears silently rolling down her face. My lifelong best friend died suddenly at 35. It was just a few days before he was supposed to get married to a girl he'd been with for 10 years and who he had wanted to marry for years, but they couldn't quite pull it off. He survived a near-death experience a few years earlier, and he made it out to all of us that things were okay, so none of us suspected he was in any danger. A surgery could have prevented the heart failure he suffered, but he could not afford this, being out of work at the time and without insurance. I was the first to know among our friends. It fell to me to tell them. He was the best of us. In an eerie mirror of how we met each friend since childhood, I had to progress through the list, calling each, telling them of this unspeakable tragedy. I relived the years as we met everyone, every good memory now agonizing. This friend was a homebody, and so we took for granted that he was okay, and never really forced him to come hang out with everybody like we should have. So ultimately we got a few extra years with him that we didn't utilize well, because he did such a good job making us all believe everything was okay that we thought it was all behind him. It's been a few years since he's gone now, but I still miss him every day. All I could say to any of them was he's gone. People afterward said I'm sorry for your loss, and I always corrected them. Losing him was everyone's loss. I had to tell my boyfriend his best friend was the body found in the river after he had been missing for 2 days. Tell my mother I was very depressed after she confronted me about a suicide note of mine she found accidentally. Hey white mom, you know that black girl you didn't want me to marry because she was black? Yeah, I married her. She disowned me and moved 18 hours away, all while trying to convince me that I was in the wrong and that she did not disown me. Classic are just normal. When my grandmother passed, we knew it was coming as she had been ill for a very long time. I was at home with my mom when my aunt called with the news that she was gone. My younger sister was at school, so we went to pick her up. When she was called to the office and she saw us there, I think a part of her knew why we came to pick her up, but that didn't make it easier to tell her. I got to tell somebody about the 9/11 attacks. He had just been laid off the previous week, so he slept in. So I called him and said, dude, we're under attack. Turn on the TV. He asked what channel. I said doesn't matter. That was a strange day all around. I had to tell one of my best friends, on his 21st birthday, which is 2 days before my birthday, that our other best friend died. His birthday is 2 days after mine. Telling my mom that her yoga instructor, our longtime family friend and man of peace Sodaman, was murdered by a religious extremist that came from another state for the sole purpose of killing him. I was only 14 at the time and struggled BC. I knew how she would react, but also she needed to know. That sucked. To tell my mom her husband had been molesting me for multiple years and that I wasn't going back into her house. When I was 13, I'd come home from school and was the first one home. I spotted a trail of blood leading up the pavement. Thought nothing of it until I realized it led into my garden and around the back of the house. Ran inside and found the trail leading upstairs to my sister's bedroom, where I found our dog, a 4-year-old black Labrador, dead, covered in blood and clearly had been in a lot of pain. My neighbor came running behind me and explained that Max had gotten out of the back somehow and took himself for a walk where he got hit by a car. He managed to drag himself home and curled up on my sister's bed. The driver had followed him and tried knocking on our door, but no one was home, so explained what had happened to a neighbor. Me and my neighbor cleaned the blood from around our house and garden. Had to call my mum and dad to tell them, and they came home as quick as they could. But my sister, 8 years old at the time, came home before then, and I had to explain why she couldn't go in her room. She ended up sleeping in my room for a week. A friend of mine at university committed suicide. I ended up sitting down with or calling some of our friends, so the first they heard of it wasn't over Facebook or in the news. 18 months on and it still eats away a bit inside. Telling 2 friends of mine that the girl they were seeing was cheating on them with each other. She was a friend of my girlfriend, so when I found out that she was stringing both of them along while each of them thought the relationship was exclusive, I had to let them know I was cheated on before and only found out because someone was looking out for and told me the truth while she was going around my back, so I felt I had to pay that forward. Still didn't make it any easier because I know how hard it is to hear that. I had to ask the vet to euthanize my cat I've had since she was a kitten. She got run over and had a broken pelvis. I was a broke college kid and had no money for surgery and she seemed to be suffering so much. There's a bright side though. They recommended a low-cost vet before deciding to euthanize. I found one and they x-rayed her. Turns out it was broken in a way to where it would heal almost perfectly without surgery, so they gave her painkillers and told me to keep her in my room. Today she's a happy healthy ball of pure unadulterated energy. Sky. I had to tell a few friends that our friend Osa, my best friend growing up, Osa killed himself at age 25. Then I and one friend I broke the news to told her roommate Osa, a girl our departed friend actually dated briefly Osa, and we just didn't have the words, so we started laughing nervously. She thought we were about to tell her a joke and she started laughing too. God, it was awful. It was like our brains couldn't process the task at hand and short-circuited. Total guru meditation. It took a few hours for it all to sink in and then I cried for days. We all did. When I left my abusive ex, having to tell his family that I was leaving and I was taking the baby. My mill is weird and we haven't always got along, but she's always loved me and my child. Telling her that there's a good chance she'll never see her grandbaby again. Especially if she chooses her own son over us. I could see the heartbreak. The worst was when I was a boy and saw our neighbor's beautiful colleague get hit and killed by a driver speeding through the neighborhood. It was horrific to witness the impact and hear the dog's impassioned yelp. Making it even sadder was that the driver knew that he had hit her, but just sped off. Telling our neighbor, as I've described here some time ago, was the hardest thing I've ever had to do because he and I both loved that special dog. P.S. Enjoy your cake day, OP. Had to tell my friend that one of her best friends jumped into traffic earlier that afternoon. That was the hardest phone call I've ever had to make. I had to tell my girlfriend that her favorite horse from this farm she used to work at passed away. In her words, her name was Applause and her nose was super squishy and she loved listening to Green Day with me. She burst out into tears when I told her and I honestly didn't look forward to seeing that. Telling my 10-year-old son that his nonna, my mum, had passed away, broke every bit of me seeing the hurt and tears well up in his eyes. And I had to tell my wife that her grandmother, who had raised her, suffered a fatal heart attack. I was racing home to tell her, not something you want to deliver over the phone if avoidable. Got home to find my wife in a sobbing heap in the driveway. One of her cousins had called to tell her minutes before I got there. My dad was a cop for 27 years, so I asked him, sir. Dad was working the midnight shift. They got a call about a car accident. Arrived on the scene to find a fatality. Turns out the guy who was killed was a police officer's son. He was also a close family friend. My dad had to go to one of his best friend and co-worker's house at like 2 AM to tell him his son had been struck and killed by a drunk driver. Not me, but I used to work as a campus safety dispatcher. We had a bad ice storm one winter, and a student got in a really bad car crash. He was in critical condition in the ICU at the hospital on campus. His family was contacted and told they needed to come say their goodbyes. His grandparents arrived first, but while his parents were en route, they were in their own car crash and both died instantly. So I had to dispatch an officer to notify the grandparents of their daughter and son-in-law's death while at the bedside of their dying grandson. I've told the story before, but I was a NIC paramedic and had to walk a guy through his own death one night. He was crushed and folded by a subway car. As soon as we moved the subway car, we knew he would bleed out. He had no family to call. I suspect it had something to do with his sexuality, and I'm a huge believer that no one dies alone. I had FDNY and the MTA set up a spot so I could crawl under the car next to him and we could talk as the process happened. I gave him plenty of morphine and he took my hand as the lift was started. I didn't let go till I pronounced him. P.S. Tommy. I stayed till we had to close the doors, man. I promised I would. My wife lights that candle for you every anniversary too. No one will ever forget you as long as I have a say. Had to call my grandmother's best friend who lives out of province that my grandma passed away. The friend didn't even know my grandma was dying. She declined over the course of a week, so the friend was blindsided. I felt awful for having to relay that news. I'm a nurse at a nursing home. It's always hard to call up someone and tell them their father died. Telling my husband that his mum had died. telling my brother-in-law that his mum had died and telling my kids that their grandma had died. Same amazing lady but 3 different conversations. Awful day. I was about 2 months into a new relationship when my new BF texted me to call right after work as he had something important to tell me. He tells me his ex, who he had broken up with 2 years prior, had called out of the blue to tell him she had HPV. He called as a very embarrassing courtesy because she told him it was contagious and his new girl, me, has HPV now. The poor dude was so embarrassed, and now that I know him so well I am sure it was a hard thing to say. I had to tell my son, not biological, no legal rights to him, that I wanted to divorce his dad. I barely see him now, and he doesn't even consider me his parent anymore. I don't really know how to deal with it. I don't even think I'm supposed to still call him my son. But how do you become a not parent to someone you've parented, largely by yourself, for 8 years? Had to call one of my best friends to tell him our other friend was to be taken off life support, and he had to come say goodbye. That was 3 years ago. Still painful but time heals.